Hi everyone, welcome to another episode of Game Design for Gamification Designers. Today I'm going to talk about organic versus artificial game mechanics. This is something that can be really useful in your designs if you understand the difference and understand what makes gamification special. First, before talking about organic and artificial game mechanics, let's make a first emphasis around the idea that we're talking about game mechanics, not just mechanics, but game mechanics. And the game part of this genitive, is really important here because it's not every kind of mechanic what we're searching for. It's not any kind of mechanism that we want to incorporate into our designs, but things that will be more game-like. So when we talk about gamification, we know it's about game-like stuff, things that work in the real world that has some borrowed elements from the game world, as we talked in our previous video, but we're going to try to incorporate them in a way that they might feel seamless. And this is hard to do. And let's begin by understanding how we can actually accomplish this objective. So if we want to create game-like mechanics, we need to understand how game mechanics work in an actual game. And that's why we're going to talk about these two concepts to understand where gamification lies in this spectrum. So let's say, for example, I was trying to design a game, not gamification, just a game. And I was thinking about making a game about an island that will produce some goods to send through ships to another place, so I can win a few doubloons. So yes, this is an actual game, of course, and part of the challenge is try to figure out what game this is. This is a classic one. So in this game, what we're going to try to do is first understand how organic mechanics are incorporated into the game world to create a sense of a simple relationship, a way of learning the rules in a way that's more familiar. So here in this case, for example, what we have is the following. If we want to make a game about creating that kind of productions, we might start by filling an island and a city with some kind of things from the real world. So if I wanted to produce, I would need some factories. So for example, here we have the tobacco storage, and we have, for example, a small indigo plant. We need some factories to produce our goods. This is something that comes from the real world. We as game designers are borrowing logics from the real world to our game world. So now what else do we need? We need a plantation. So we are going to plant here some indigo and some tobacco in our island, and we're just creating game components. These are game elements that I'm bringing into the game world just to try to make it feel more familiar. So if I have my tobacco plantations and my indigo plantation, I will have to have as well the corresponding factory. And here, this is logical. This is logical in every sense. We are just incorporating how this could work in the real world into the game world. Now, let's say I'm going to take some cubes from here, and I will say these are my workers. The game actually has its own workers. I'm just going to use these pieces. And so, for example, if I place a worker here in the factory, I will need also a worker here in the plantation, so I can produce some goods. And now we're trying to create the idea of a factory system. A system of production requires the man work, the factories and the plantations to actually produce the goods. This is something that's still really familiar. So if I have two workers here and two workers here, I might produce at the end of my turn or something like that, I will produce a couple of tobaccos. Now, I might produce some indigos as well. So let's pick a couple more of these, and I will place one here and place one here, and I will gather one indigo. So everything I have told you are the organic mechanics. This is something that's really familiar, and it's not really part of what makes a game designer great, right? We're just making abstractions. So that's the first principle. It's that you are going to try to bring the real world into your game, but not as it is. It's an abstraction of the real world. Of course, we might have in some games to pay for the workers. In other games, you actually don't pay for those workers. You actually just, I don't know, maybe you have to pay them with food or with money. That depends on the game world you're building. But what you're making is a simplified version of the real world, so you can actually anticipate how the game will be played. Now, this is fine, and this is where most game designers begin. Some game designers will start by incorporating some artificial mechanics, but in most cases, especially if you're a new game designer, beginning by the organic mechanics is actually easier because it's just incorporating logic from the real world. But here's where it becomes complicated. Every game has a relationship between organic and artificial mechanics. The more organic mechanics you have, it's a more thematic game. If you have more artificial mechanics, of course, it will be an abstract game. So what do we have here? In this same game, let's bring this out and let's place these tokens. So what happens in this game is the following. When you want to make a game move, you actually have to take a role. You will play as a certain role in a certain game round. So you have the captain, the settler, the trader, the builder, the prospector, and the craftsman. Let's take the prospector away. Let's just work with these ones for this video. So what happens here is you still have some organic mechanics because you can actually try to understand what these roles might do in the game. So the craftsman will be in charge of producing the goods, right? The builder might be the one in charge of producing our factories. The captain will be the one in charge of bringing the goods to the old world, in this case, through shipping them and sailing them away. Now the settler will be the one that allows you to create some plantations. And the trader will allow you to exchange certain goods for another kind of goods in the game. So as you can see, these still are kind of organic mechanics because they're still borrowing the logic from the real world. It makes it easier to understand the game. Now, here's where it becomes complicated in this game, because when you play this particular game, you will be able in your round to choose one of these roles. And then after that, you will get a benefit, but all the other players will actually be able to use the same action as you're doing here. And as you can see, that particular mechanic doesn't respect the real world rules. It creates some kind of artificial conflict. Now, I have talked about this before. Conflict is what really makes a game interesting. There needs to be some tension and some conflict for it to be a good game. So we're taking all the things that we don't need from the real world to make an abstraction, and then we're creating some conflict by creating some artificial rules. This is the part of where artificial game mechanics come from, because these kind of rules, during the real life, you cannot choose your role. You cannot say, I'm going to be this round a captain and then a builder and then a craftsman. This goes against the real world logic. And here's where you make some leap of faith. You actually deliver yourself into the game, and every game has this. Even video games that try to be really good simulations have some mechanics that actually don't correspond to the real life. And this is really important. For example, if you play some video games, shooters, for example, when they shoot you, the first bullets have a lower probability of hitting you than later bullets if the enemy keeps shooting and you don't kill him quickly. And that's incorporated into the game world, and it's not organic because that's not how it would work in the real life. It's artificial, just to give you a sense of control when you find an enemy for the first time. And that's something that has been incorporated into many, many video games, and it's a rule that breaks the rules of the real world, of how the real world works. For example, if you know Sid Meier's Civilization, when Sid Meier tells you you have a 30% chance of something occurring in the game, actually the algorithm is built so you actually think it's a 30% in the way your brain understands a 30%, not in the way of how probabilities work in the real life. So in this 30% scenario in Sid Meier's Civilization, the algorithm is skewed, is biased, so you will get a hit more or less one of every 3 times, which is not how probabilities work in the real world. So this, for example, is a way of creating artificial mechanics. And why is this important for gamification? Another artificial mechanic in this game is, for example, if you have a ship and you deliver a couple of these goods into this ship with a captain action, you will not be able to place a good of another kind in the same ship. And this again goes against the logic of the real world. So again, why is this important for gamification? What can we take from this in terms of how to transform this idea, this game design concept, into a gamification concept? So let's clear the board a little bit here. We have a problem that when you're building a game, you will try to borrow stuff from the real world to your game and then transform it and then process it. You will try to create some different logics inside the game to make it more appealing, because game mechanics are about creating mechanics that will increase the tension in a way that still increases the enjoyment of the game. And this is really important. The enjoyment of the game must be increased with everything you're doing here. So that's great, but what happens when you work with gamification? When you have gamification here, gamification begins with a problem in the real world. So the real world logic is incorporated beforehand in a gamification project. The gamification project is part of the real world, is part of it. So we cannot just start creating organic mechanics. What creates a really interesting gamification project is actually the idea that you can incorporate into the real world all these artificial mechanics that comes from the game world. So you're bringing from the game, you're breaking here, you're bringing from the game the logics of the game designer, the lens of the game designer. You're creating all these artificial mechanics into your gamification project to actually change the way the real world behaves. And this is really important. Let's try to figure this out in a more real world example. Let's try to incorporate this into the real world. So what happens if, for example, we're going to gamify an online shopping experience? So, the regular online shopping experience would be something like this. I have some products, for example, a boiler and an ether tube, a compactor, a difference engine, a clockwork rooster, why not? A lens, a piping, wires. So we have all these different products, and what we're going to try to do in the real world is just use the mechanics that are organic for the real world. So just let's say I placed the word ether on my filters, and so everything here disappeared and I got my ether tube here, and now I will just place it in my shopping cart. Let's say this is, for example, my shopping cart, and I will place it here, and then I will have to make a checkout. Maybe I incorporated a couple more products, the totals are sum up, and then I place some money into the system, and in return they will send this to your home, and we have a shopping experience. And this mechanic is so widely used that you can actually buy templates for this mechanic in using Shopify, Magento, or something like that, right? Now, what happens if we want to gamify this mechanic? So some of you might say, okay, let's just say that if you buy 3 products, I will give you 3 tokens, which can then be redeemed for a discount in my product. And if you buy 3 of these products, I will give you a medal. You're the clockwork rooster buyer. And that seems great, but it's actually not that interesting in terms of a game, because why am I playing to get this badge? What is so important around working my way up into getting this badge? That might not be interesting enough for an online experience. So let's try to think in terms of our artificial mechanics, and let's create something more interesting. Maybe not perfect. I'm not trying to gamify an online shopping experience here. I'm just trying to show you what it means to think through this lens. So let's say something like this. We have a featured product section where we have, I don't know, these three blue products, right? We have the clockwork rooster, the compactor, and the difference engine. And now we will have some of our, some of our tokens from the previous game, some of our tiles, and we will use them to create some game actions. So for example, each day a player, I don't know which player, I will talk about massive online mechanics later on, because of course if we have thousands of customers this will be harder to incorporate. But let's say some customers by a bidding mechanic or something can select one of these 3 actions to do today, and let's say they say, okay, we're going to use the builder, and the builder will allow us to create some bidding mechanics where I can build my influence in these different scenarios. I'm just using the word to inspire myself into creating something. This is not something that should work this way, but let's say something like this. So we have the builder, and we have 3 players here trying to build some influence around the different products. And that's great. So now the day goes on, and the next action, again, we can select an action for the next day, and someone says, I want to play the trader, or by a bidding mechanic, they say we're going to play the trader. And the trader allows us to change some influence tokens from one product to another. And why are we trying to do this? Because in some moment of the game, someone will play, or we will play the craftsman, and the craftsman will allows us to change all these influence tokens into actual discounts, which will be the discounts for each product. Maybe if you have more influence from different players, you will get the higher discount into this product. And maybe if you have a product that has a lot of influence from one player, he might have a lesser discount, so maybe just a 2 token discount here, but only for the player that influenced that product. That can be a rule. So now with what we have here, and maybe this will have just one for participation, I don't know. So we might have this mechanic that will allow us to create something interesting in the future, because now we're changing the way the administrator or the moderator works around the discounts of the system. This is not something that you will be able to create with a Shopify template, of course. You will have to make some programming. That's part of what happens with gamification. But this kind of things can release the tension of the admins trying to create the discounts and give that power to the people by creating a great experience where you feel that, like you're influencing the system. And in this sense, if you try to think about what I built here, this is not actually a great example, but you can build from that. And there are a lot of games. I just picked one game as a reference for my artificial mechanics, but I could have done something really different from different kinds of games. But what will happen here is, if you understand how gamification works, you can understand, for example, what's the difference between Duolingo and Tinder. Because, of course, Duolingo is a great system. I will never criticize Duolingo per se, because it really creates some of the best game mechanics for its type of game in the early times of gamification, which is actually kind of weird. But they try to create one of these models around self-improvement, where getting medals and getting badges and leveling up and being better and having a self-competition made sense. So it worked in this context. These kinds of badges and mechanics with experience points worked great. But Tinder took another approach, and I believe Tinder is more of a gamification project than many gamification projects out there, because Tinder changed the way we understood the dating world by creating a matching mechanic. And matching mechanics, you can see matching mechanics in games everywhere. You can do matching mechanics with almost anything. And many people have tried to replicate the matching mechanic, the mechanism, without understanding the context in different situations. But matching mechanics are great because they create a sense of randomness, and it takes a little bit of empowerment, but gives you a lot of other things. And of course, just creating artificial mechanics is not enough. You need to create the best mechanics for the environment in the real world you're building upon. You have the organic mechanics already in place. What you need to think is how you can change them through this lens to create better systems. And that's what thinking around game mechanics should be. It shouldn't be about incorporating the elements. It should be around understanding how I can create a better system through the rule sets I'm building for it. And that's a better way of understanding gamification. I hope you like this. My next video will go around understanding around game mechanics, conflicts, because when you have different game mechanics or different mechanics in your system, there will be conflicts and there will be incentives. And for example, in our previous example, maybe this game system where we had all these pieces was great, but maybe people just want to buy the compactor today without having to wait 3 days. So we still have the regular organic mechanics, and the two mechanics will be in conflict. I want to talk about how to understand that conflict between game mechanics, to understand how many you need, how well they will interact with your organic mechanisms, and how you can nudge behaviors towards one or another, and when you shouldn't nudge that behavior. I hope you like that. If you like that topic, just let me know. If you have any other topics you want to talk to me about, please leave them in the comments. I would love to engage in discussions, and let's keep in touch. Thank you.